The encounter at the gas station. Rain drizzled softly over the cracked pavement of the lonely highway, painting the night in streaks of silver as the dim glow of streetlights flickered against the wet asphalt. The road stretched endlessly into the darkness, winding past farmlands and quiet forests that seemed to be holding their breath under the cloudy sky. Midnight had long passed, and only the occasional hum of an 18-wheeler or the whine of a distant car broke the stillness. At mile marker 97 stood a small gas station, the kind of place that had long ago seen better days, where the neon "open" sign buzzed faintly in the front window of a convenience store that looked more tired than alive. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, damp earth, and the promise of another storm rolling in before dawn. Jake Miller guided his rusty old pickup into the station and pulled up beside pump number 4. The truck sputtered and groaned, a tired beast that had served him well through years of long drives, late nights, and endless repairs. He switched off the engine and exhaled, rubbing his temple as exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His shift at the construction yard had dragged longer than expected, and every muscle in his body begged for rest. 30 more minutes on the road, and he'd finally be home, where his worn couch and a warm blanket were waiting. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the back seat, where his 4-year-old son Noah slept soundly, small hands curled around a faded stuffed bear, his little chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of dreams. Jake's gaze softened. Everything he did, the long hours, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, was for that boy. He climbed out of the truck, pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, and swiped his card at the pump. The machine groaned as the gas began to flow, and Jake tucked his hands into his pockets, shivering as a gust of wind blew rain into his face. He glanced around the quiet station. The fluorescent lights above flickered, buzzing faintly, casting pale halos onto the wet ground. The convenience store door was locked, its darkened interior barely visible through the smudged glass. For a moment, it seemed he was alone in the world. Just him, Noah, and the hum of the gas pump in the silence of the night. Then he noticed movement. A flicker, subtle at first, near the far corner of the store where a cracked concrete step jutted out beneath the awning. His eyes adjusted and his breath caught. A young woman sat hunched on the step, soaked to the bone as rainwater dripped from her blonde hair. She was hugging her knees tightly, trembling as though the night itself had swallowed her whole. Her face was partly buried against her arms, but even from a distance Jake could hear the faint, broken sound of quiet sobs. Her shoulders shook with the weight of her tears, and her body seemed so small, so fragile against the vast emptiness of the night. Jake hesitated. His first instinct was to look away. It wasn't his business. Everyone had their battles, their storms to weather, and maybe she didn't want anyone intruding on hers. But something about the way she sat there, the utter defeat in her posture, the way her whole body seemed to shrink as if she wanted to disappear from the world, stirred something in him. He had seen pain before. He had carried it himself, and he knew the sound of a soul breaking quietly in the dark. He finished fueling the truck, replaced the nozzle, and glanced once more at Noah through the window. The boy was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the world outside. Jake closed the door quietly, shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets, and took a cautious step toward the woman. The rain picked up slightly, tapping on the awning above. Her like impatient fingers, she didn't look up, didn't move. For a moment, Jake wondered if she even realized someone was there. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough from fatigue but gentle. "You okay?" The girl startled. Her head shot up, and wide blue eyes met his, filled with fear and sorrow all at once. For a moment she looked like a deer caught in headlights, unsure whether to run or stay frozen. Her lips parted but no words came. She just stared at him, rain dripping from her hair onto her pale face, mixing with the tears that streaked her cheeks. Her clothes, a once elegant blouse and skirt now clinging to her from the rain, were far too fine for a night spent sitting on concrete. Something about her was out of place here, as if she had stepped from one world into another by accident. "I'm not here to bother you," Jake added quickly, raising a hand slightly in reassurance. "Just thought you might need help. It's a rough night to be sitting out here." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then finally she shook her head slightly. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice cracked, betraying the lie. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand as if trying to erase the evidence of her pain, but her trembling didn't stop. Jake frowned, shifting his weight. "Doesn't look that way," he said gently. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but I've got a thermos of coffee in the truck. It's not much, but it's warm. You're welcome to it." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, suspicion even. He could see the wariness in her gaze, the way she studied him like a cornered animal, unsure of the hunter's intentions. He didn't blame her. The world wasn't kind to women alone at night, and trust wasn't given freely. Jake simply nodded toward his truck where Noah was barely visible through the fogged glass of the window. "My little boy's in there. He's asleep. We're just on our way home. Nothing more." Something shifted in her eyes at that. The sight of the small sleeping child seemed to soften her edges, to remind her that not every stranger carried danger. She hesitated a moment longer, then whispered, "Thank you." Jake nodded and turned back to the truck, grabbing the dented thermos from the front seat. He poured steaming liquid into the lid, the smell of bitter coffee rising into the damp night air, and carried it back to her. She took it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. They were icy cold, like porcelain left out in the rain. "Careful, it's hot," he said, though she barely seemed to hear him. She took a cautious sip, then closed her eyes as warmth spread through her. For the first time, her shoulders relaxed just slightly, though the sadness in her expression didn't fade. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently, crouching a few feet away to avoid towering over her. She hesitated, clutching the cup like it was the only solid thing in her life. Finally, she whispered, "Claire." "Claire," he repeated softly. The name lingered in the air, delicate as the rain. "I'm Jake, and that little guy in the truck, he's Noah." Her eyes flicked toward the truck, and for the first time a faint hint of a smile touched her lips. "He looks peaceful," she murmured. Her voice carried a trace of longing, like peace was a language she hadn't spoken in a long time. "He is," Jake said. "Kids are good at that. They don't carry the weight of the world yet." Claire lowered her gaze again, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, an emotion so subtle, Jake almost missed it. But when he saw it, something clicked inside him. She was pregnant. His chest tightened with a surge of compassion. Whatever her story was, she wasn't just carrying her own burden. She was carrying another life within her, and she was out here, in the rain, alone. He wanted to ask, wanted to know why, but he bit back the question. She didn't owe him her story. And not tonight, maybe not ever. For now, it was enough that she had accepted the coffee, that she wasn't entirely alone anymore. The shelter in the storm. The truck's old heater rattled softly, pushing warm air into the cabin and fogging the windows against the cold drizzle outside. The storm had grown heavier, raindrops racing each other down the glass in blurred streaks, the kind of rain that swallowed roads and muffled sound until the whole world felt muted and gray. Inside the truck, though, there was a fragile cocoon of warmth. Claire sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching Jake's old thermos like it was the only anchor she had left in a life that felt like it was breaking apart. Her hair clung damply to her cheeks, her clothes carried the heavy scent of rain, and her hands still trembled faintly, though she did her best to hide it. She sat straight-backed, her shoulders tense, as if even in exhaustion she couldn't let her guard down. Noah shifted in the back seat, a soft whimper slipping from his lips before his tiny fingers clutched tighter to the stuffed bear in his arms. Claire turned slightly, her blue eyes falling on him. For a moment, something in her face changed. Her guarded expression softened, her lips parting just slightly, and her eyes grew wet again, but not from the same despair that had covered her earlier. This time it was something else, something tender. Watching the boy sleep, so peaceful and innocent, seemed to tug at a place deep inside her chest. She lifted her hand unconsciously and placed it against her own stomach, as though reminding herself that she too was carrying such innocence, that she too had a reason to fight through the storm. Jake noticed the gesture. He said nothing, though the sight lodged itself firmly in his mind. He knew that touch. It was a mother's instinct, or the beginning of it. His heart ached with empathy, but he stayed quiet, letting her have her moment, He leaned back against the seat and stared at the streaked windshield, giving her pace to breathe. Minutes passed in silence, filled only with the hum of the heater and the rain's rhythm on the metal roof. Then softly Claire spoke. Her voice was low, almost as though she feared it might break if she spoke too loudly. "Your son," she murmured, her eyes still on Noah. "He sleeps like he trusts the whole world." Jake glanced at her, surprised she had broken the silence. "He does," he replied after a moment. "Kids, they don't know yet that the world can hurt them. They trust because they believe someone will always keep them safe." Her throat moved as she swallowed. "And you do," she whispered. "I try," Jake said simply, his voice carrying the weight of promises made and kept. "That's my job." She turned her gaze forward again, blinking quickly as though trying to hide the sudden sting of tears. She shifted uncomfortably, as if searching for words. At last she whispered, "I haven't felt safe in a long time." The words lingered, hanging heavy between them. Jake didn't press. He understood what it meant to carry wounds you weren't ready to reveal. Instead, he adjusted the heater, making sure the air flowed stronger, toward her side and said, "You are now, at least for tonight." Claire's lips parted, but no reply came. She simply nodded faintly, clutching the thermos tighter, as though she wanted to believe him, as though she was clinging to the fragile thread of comfort his words offered. The minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Outside, the rain poured harder, drumming like fists against the roof. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Jake knew they couldn't sit here forever. He stole another glance at Claire. She looked exhausted, her eyes half-lidded, her body leaning slightly against the door. Yet she fought to stay upright, as though even the idea of closing her eyes in a stranger's truck was too much vulnerability. "You can rest," Jake said gently. "I'll keep watch. And if you're worried about trust, look, I don't know your story, and you don't know mine, but I've got a kid in the back. I'd never do anything that'd put him in danger, so you're safe." Claire looked at him for a long moment, studying him as though she could see into his soul. At last she exhaled and let her head rest lightly against the cool glass of the window. Her hand drifted down again to her stomach, fingers splaying protectively over the curve there. In that moment, Jake saw not just a frightened girl in the rain, but a mother in the making. Someone trying desperately to protect her unborn child from a world that had already taken too much from her. Lightning flashed in the distance and thunder rolled like a drumbeat across the sky. The storm had swallowed the highway completely, and the gas station felt more isolated than ever. Jake drummed his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, his instincts prickling. Something about this night felt strange, heavier than just a storm. His gut told him this girl's story was more complicated than a bad night or an argument that had driven her away from home. There was something bigger lurking beneath the surface. Noah stirred again, sitting up slightly in the back seat. His small eyes blinked open, groggy with sleep, before he spotted Claire. For a moment, he looked confused, then his face lit up in the innocent way only a child's could. "Hi," he mumbled sleepily, clutching his bear tighter. Claire startled, then smiled softly. "Hi," she whispered back. "I'm Noah," the boy said proudly, his voice slurred with drowsiness. "What's your name?" "Claire," she replied, her voice trembling faintly but carrying warmth that hadn't been there before. Noah nodded as though satisfied. "Claire," he repeated. "That's pretty." Then he lay back down, pulling the bear against his chest. Within seconds he was asleep again, his trust so pure it could bring tears to anyone's eyes. Claire turned away quickly, wiping at her face as though Noah's innocent words had broken something inside her. But Jake saw, and his chest tightened. He recognized that reaction, the way kindness sometimes hurt more than cruelty when you'd gone too long without it. Outside, a pair of headlights cut through the storm for a brief moment, sweeping across the gas station lot. A black SUV slowed as it passed, its tinted windows reflecting the rain-streaked lights. Claire froze instantly. Her hand gripped the thermos so tightly her knuckles whitened. She sat rigid, her eyes locked on the vehicle until it disappeared down the highway. Jake noticed. He saw the fear in her body, the way her breathing quickened, the way her entire frame tensed like a hunted animal. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, not yet. Instead, he made a quiet mental note. Whoever she was, whatever she was running from, it wasn't just shadows of the past. It was something real, something close, something still searching for her. The truck's cab fell back into silence, though the weight of it had changed. Claire's hand remained pressed against her stomach, her eyes wide as she stared out the rain-soaked window. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his instincts sharpening. He didn't know the full truth yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to leave her out here alone, not tonight. And as the storm raged around them, Jake Miller realized this was no ordinary encounter. He had stepped into something larger than himself, something that would test his strength, his heart, and every part of the quiet life he had fought so hard to build. He didn't know it yet, but the woman sitting in his passenger seat wasn't just a stranger in need. She was a storm of her own, one that was about to change Eve. Writhing. Secrets beneath the surface. The storm had not eased when Jake finally turned the key and brought the truck to life. The wipers screeched across the windshield, fighting against the relentless sheets of rain. The headlights carved two narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating the slick highway ahead. Jake eased the truck onto the road, his knuckles tight against the wheel. Claire sat beside him, staring silently out the side window, her reflection pale and ghostly against the glass. She held her arms around herself as though she were trying to hold her entire world together, but the slight tremor of her shoulders betrayed her struggle. Noah had slipped back into a deep sleep, curled in the back seat with the kind of innocence adults forgot long ago. His little snores filled the cab, soft and steady, reminding Jake that his son was the anchor in this world. Every decision Jake made, every extra hour he worked, every quiet sacrifice was for that boy. And now, for reasons he didn't quite understand, there was someone else sitting beside him who seemed as fragile as a flame in the wind, and he could not ignore her either. For several miles, the truck was filled only with the hum of the engine and the steady percussion of rain. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice even, careful not to startle her. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but if someone's after you, I need to know what we're up against. My son's in this truck. His safety comes first." Claire didn't respond right away. Her jaw tightened, her eyes glistened as if her thoughts battled for release, but she stayed quiet. At last her lips parted, her words spilling softly into the night. "I didn't plan any of this," she whispered. "I didn't plan to end up on the side of the road, alone, in the rain. I thought I could keep it together, thought I could control everything. But I was wrong." Jake Glass instanced her, sensing the weight behind her words. "Control what?" She shook her head, clutching her stomach as though protecting the life inside her was the only thing she was sure of anymore. "My life, my future, everything." And then it all fell apart. Jake remained quiet, letting her find her own pace. He had learned in the army, and later as a single father, that sometimes silence was the best gift you could give someone. Silence and presence. Claire's hands trembled against her lap. "He was supposed to love me," she said, her voice breaking. "But he loved power more. When I found out the truth, I couldn't stay. I had to run." Jake's eyes hardened. He had seen this pattern before, men who valued control, money, and pride above the people who trusted them. He thought of Noah's mother, who had walked away when life grew too heavy, leaving Jake to carry both the burden and the blessing of raising their child alone. Different details, but the same bitter taste of betrayal. "Where were you heading?" Jake asked gently. Claire's eyes flicked toward him, her lips parting as though to answer, but then she stopped herself. "I don't know anymore," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I thought I could disappear, but I was wrong. They'll find me." The words chilled Jake more than the storm outside. "Who's they?" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes again. She wanted to tell him. He could see it in the trembling of her lips, the way she glanced at him as if searching for someone she could finally trust. But before she could answer, Noah stirred in the back seat. "Daddy?" the boy mumbled sleepily, his voice soft and confused. "Are we home yet?" Jake glanced back quickly. "Not yet, bud. Go back to sleep." But Noah had already lifted his head enough to peer at Claire. In the dim light of the dashboard, he studied her face with the simple curiosity only a child could have. "Don't cry," he said softly, his words slurred with drowsiness. "Daddy always makes things better. Trust and betrayal." The diner's lights flickered faintly as a delivery truck rumbled past on the highway outside, its headlights sweeping across the rain-streaked windows before disappearing into the storm. Inside, the three of them sat in a fragile bubble of warmth, the hum of the heater, the clatter of plates from the kitchen, and the low murmur of a country song on the jukebox forming a background against the silence that had settled at their table. The newspaper lay spread open between Jake and Claire, its ink still faintly damp, her picture staring out like a ghost of another life. She looked so different in that glossy image, perfect hair, flawless suit, eyes sharp with confidence. The woman sitting in front of him now bore almost no resemblance to that carefully crafted photograph. This Claire had shadows under her eyes, her hair tangled from the rain, her blouse wrinkled and clinging to her as though the storm had tried to wash her whole identity away. Jake leaned back slowly, his hands resting on the table, his expression unreadable. "So it's true," he said at last, his voice low, steady. "You're not just someone passing through. You're the Claire Reynolds, the CEO of Reynolds Tech." Her fingers tightened around the mug, her eyes darting to the door, then back to him. "I was," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "I don't know what I am anymore." Jake studied her carefully, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Reynolds Tech was no small company. It was a global empire of software, security, and innovation, a name that had made headlines for years. And here she was, sitting in a rundown diner, pregnant and hiding like a fugitive. He wanted to ask 100 questions. Why? How? What had driven her here? But he forced himself to slow down. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said gently, though his voice carried quiet steel. "But I need to understand enough to know if helping you is going to put my son at risk. That's all I care about." Claire's eyes filled with tears again, and she pressed her hands against the warm mug as though clinging to it for strength. "I never meant to involve anyone," she murmured. I couldn't go back. I couldn't let them control me anymore." "Who's them?" Jake asked. Her lips trembled, her gaze falling to the table. "The board," she whispered. "And Daniel, my fiancé. He was supposed to be my partner. We built the company together, but I found out the truth too late. He wasn't just planning to take control. He was willing to destroy me to do it. When I told him I was pregnant, I thought it would change something. Thought it would make him see beyond numbers and power. Instead, he told me my child would be his leverage, that he'd use my baby as the chain to keep me tied to him." Jake's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but there was something particularly vile in the thought of a man using an unborn child as a weapon. He wanted to curse Daniel's name, but he kept his voice even for Claire's sake. "So you ran," Jake said quietly. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I left everything, the company, the house, the life everyone thought was perfect. I left because I knew if I stayed, my baby would never belong to me. And now they're looking for me. Not because they care, but because they can't control me if I'm gone." Jake took a slow breath. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. Claire looked up, startled. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jake replied. "I know what it's like to be betrayed by someone you thought you could trust. I know what it's like to fight for your child when the world wants to take him from you. And I know what it's like to start over when you've got nothing left." His words silenced her. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, and all that remained was the connection between them. Two people who had lived very different lives, but whose scars carried the same shape. Noah stirred again, his small hand reaching across the seat. "Daddy," he mumbled. Jake placed a steady hand on his son's back, soothing him. When he looked up, Claire was watching, her eyes filled with something different now, something softer, more trusting. "You don't have to help me," she said, her voice trembling. "You've already done more than anyone else would." Jake shook his head. "You're not alone anymore. Not tonight, and as long as you're with me, nobody's going to touch you." The waitress approached their booth, refilling their mugs. She glanced at the newspaper still open on the table, her brows furrowing. For a moment, Jake thought she might say something, but she simply shrugged and walked away. Claire stiffened anyway, her hand instinctively going to her stomach again. Jake leaned forward, his voice lowering. "We need to be careful. If people recognize you, word could get out, and if those men in that SUV were looking for you, they won't stop." Claire's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "You saw them too?" "I saw the way you froze when they passed," Jake said quietly. "I've been around enough danger to know when someone's running scared. Whoever they are, they're connected to the man you left behind, which means we can't stay here long." "So?" He nodded quickly, her knuckles white around the mug. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I've been driving aimlessly, stopping at motels, hiding in gas stations. I thought if I stayed moving, they'd lose my trail. But they haven't." Jake looked at her steadily, his mind already working through the possibilities. His life had been one of discipline, of planning, of learning to trust instincts forged in harder years. He knew when danger was close, and every instinct told him they were running out of time. "Then you'll stay with me," he said simply. Claire's eyes widened. "What? I can't—" "Yes, you can," Jake interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "My place isn't much, just a small house on the edge of town, but it's quiet, safe. Nobody would think to look for a CEO millionaire hiding in a broken-down truck with a single dad and his kid. If you want to disappear, that's where you start." For a long moment, Claire just stared at him, her breath trembling, her mind clearly torn between fear and relief. Finally, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Jake leaned back, nodding once. Then it settled. But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. Bringing her into his home meant inviting danger into his life, into Noah's life. Yet looking at Claire, the fear in her eyes, the hand that never left her stomach, he knew he couldn't do anything else. His conscience wouldn't allow it. Outside, thunder cracked, rattling the windows. The storm had not passed. Neither had the danger. And somewhere out on those dark, rain-slick roads, the black SUV circled back, its passengers scanning the night for the woman who had slipped from their grasp. Jake didn't know it yet, but the decision he had just made would draw a line he could never erase. A line between safety and danger, between the quiet life he had built and the storm that was about to crash into it. The fight for freedom. The rain had thinned by the time Jake guided the old truck back onto the dark highway, but the storm's shadow still lingered in the night sky, thick with rolling clouds that swallowed the moonlight. The diner's neon sign faded behind them, swallowed by distance and darkness, and all that remained was the endless ribbon of wet roads stretching into nowhere. Inside the cab, Noah slept once again, his small face turned against the seat, his hand clutching the bear as if it were his greatest treasure. Claire sat quietly beside him, staring at her reflection in the passenger side window. The neon headlines of her old life seemed to echo faintly in her mind. Her polished smile, the press conferences, the interviews where she was praised for her brilliance and determination. Now she was none of those things. Now she was a fugitive from her own success, clinging to the safety of a stranger's kindness. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the road, his posture calm but alert. Years of service had etched a kind of discipline into him that never left. His senses were always sharpened, scanning for threats, measuring risk, calculating safety in every shadow. He didn't talk much as he drove. Words felt small compared to the weight of what was unspoken between them. He knew she was afraid. He knew she was holding back pieces of her story that still cut too deep to reveal. And he knew the danger was not behind them. It was still chasing, maybe even closer now. An hour passed before the first sign appeared. Headlights in the distance, steady and growing, catching the glint of wet asphalt like knives slicing through the dark. Jake's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, his jaw tightening. A black SUV, its shape unmistakable even through the sheets of lingering rain, was gaining ground. He didn't say anything at first. He simply pressed the accelerator a little harder, the old truck groaning as it picked up speed. Claire noticed. Her eyes darted to the mirror, then to Jake's face. She saw it there, the tightening jaw, the focused stare, the calm that wasn't calm at all, but the silence of a storm about to break. Her breath caught. It's them, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't ask how she knew. He could feel it too. Stay calm, he said, his voice even, controlled. We're not going to panic. If they're following, they'll try to spook us first. Let's not give them the satisfaction. The SUV drew closer, its headlights flashing once, then again, too deliberate to be coincidence. Claire gripped the dashboard with one hand and her stomach with the other, her knuckles white. Jake kept driving, eyes scanning the road ahead, his mind calculating exits, back roads, options. He had learned long ago that fear clouded judgment, and if there was one thing he could not afford tonight, it was clouded judgment. The SUV sped forward, closing the gap until it loomed behind them, its grille dominating the mirror. Jake felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. Hold on. With a sudden movement, he turned off the highway onto a side road, tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. The SUV followed, its headlights swinging around the bend like a predator locking onto its prey. Claire's breath came fast now. Jake! I've got this, he said firmly, his voice like iron. The side road was narrow, lined with tall trees that formed a dark tunnel around them. Jake pushed the truck harder than he ever had before, the old engine roaring in protest, but the SUV stayed close, its lights flooding the mirrors, too close, too precise. Jake knew they weren't just random men, they were trained, deliberate, controlled. Whoever had sent them hadn't just sent thugs, he had sent hunters. Noah stirred in the back, his eyes blinking, open at the sudden jerks of the truck. Daddy? His small voice wavered with confusion and fear. It's okay, buddy, Jake said quickly, his eyes never leaving the road. Go back to sleep. Daddy's just taking a different way home. But Noah didn't go back to sleep. His wide eyes watched as the lights behind them grew brighter. He hugged his bear tighter, sensing that something was very wrong. Claire reached back instinctively, placing her hand over Noah's. It's all right, sweetheart, she whispered, though her voice shook. We're safe. But inside she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything except that the man driving this truck was the only thing standing between her and the nightmare chasing her. Jake made a sudden decision, pulling sharply onto a dirt road that veered into the woods. Gravel flew as the truck skidded, the SUV swerving behind them, still in pursuit. Branches whipped against the sides of the truck, the headlights bouncing wildly as the path narrowed. Claire's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. Then, just as suddenly, Jake cut the headlights, plunging them into near darkness. He slowed the truck, guiding it carefully off the road and into the shadows of thick trees. The engine hummed softly as he brought the truck to a stop, tucked deep where the branches and leaves concealed them. He switched the ignition off, silence swallowing the cab. He raised one finger to his lips, signaling Claire and Noah to stay quiet. They waited. Seconds felt like hours as the SUV roared past, its headlights sweeping the road ahead before fading into the distance. Claire held her breath until the sound disappeared completely. Only then did Jake exhale, his hands still steady on the wheel, though his heart thundered in his chest. For several moments, silence lingered. Noah clung to his bear, his little chest rising and falling quickly. Claire pressed her forehead to her hand, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Relief mixed with terror, leaving her trembling. Jake finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. We can't keep running like this. If they're this close already, it means they know where to look. They'll be back. Claire lifted her head, her eyes red with tears. Then what do we do? Jake looked at her, his gaze hard, determined. We stop running. If they want to come after you, after us, then we make sure they regret it. His words sent a shiver through her. There was no arrogance in his tone, no reckless bravado. It was simply truth, spoken by a man who had faced danger before and had no intention of letting it win now. For the first time since she had left her old life, Claire felt something stronger than fear. She felt the faint spark of hope that maybe she wasn't doomed to be hunted forever, that maybe with this man and his little boy, she could find safety, strength, and even freedom again. Outside, the storm finally began to break, the clouds parting slightly to reveal a pale sliver of moonlight. But for Jake and Claire, The real storm had only just begun. Rebuilding trust in the world, the dirt road eventually led them out of the forest and back toward the edge of a quiet town, a place so small and tucked away it hardly existed on maps. By the time Jake slowed the truck in front of a modest single-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, the night had grown still again. The storm had moved farther east, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and the glisten of rain clinging to every surface. The old house stood like a tired sentinel at the end of a gravel driveway, its windows glowing faintly with the soft yellow light of the lamp Jake had left on before work. It wasn't much, but it was home, the only constant Jake and Noah had known for years. Jake parked, shutting off the engine. For a moment, silence filled the cab. Claire stared at the little house, her hands resting over her stomach, her thoughts tangled between disbelief and longing. To anyone else, this house might look worn down, small, and ordinary. To her, it looked like peace. After weeks of hiding in motels and sleeping in her car, this simple home looked like the promise of safety, even if just for one night. "Come on," Jake said softly, opening the door. He lifted Noah carefully into his arms, the boy murmuring sleepily but nestling into his father's shoulder without opening his eyes. Claire followed slowly, her legs stiff, her body aching from exhaustion. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath her weight, and felt the strange sensation of entering a space that was lived in, real, grounded. Not a hotel room stripped of warmth, not a mansion filled with lies, but a place where a child's laughter had probably echoed and where simple dinners had been shared at a worn table. Inside, the living room was modest but warm, a couch with cushions that didn't match, a bookshelf lined with old paperbacks and a few framed photos, a rug worn thin from years of little feet running across it. The faint scent of pine cleaner lingered in the air, mixed with the familiar smell of home cooking that clung to the walls of a house that had seen many meals. Claire paused just inside the doorway, her throat tightening. This wasn't luxury, but it was love. And love, she realized, was what she had been missing all along. Jake set Noah down in his small bed tucked into a corner room, pulling the blanket up around him and kissing his forehead with a tenderness that melted Claire's heart. She lingered at the doorway, watching. It wasn't just that Jake provided for his son, he cherished him. She had seen fathers in her world who measured love in gifts and mountain, who appeared in photographs but disappeared in presence. Jake was different. His love was steady, quiet, constant. When Jake stepped back into the hallway, he caught Claire's expression. She quickly looked away, embarrassed at having been caught watching. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod toward the kitchen. "You should eat something. I'll put on some soup." Claire followed him, lowering herself into a chair at the small kitchen table. She ran her hand along its surface, worn smooth by years of use. A few scratches and crayon marks were etched into the wood, likely remnants of Noah's drawings. Each mark told a story of life lived here, messy, imperfect, real. As Jake moved around the kitchen, pulling out a pot and ingredients with practiced ease, Claire found herself speaking softly. "You do everything for him, don't you?" Jake glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah," he said simply. "He's all I've got." He poured broth into the pot, his movement steady. "When his mom left, I thought I'd never figure it out. I was scared, angry, lost. But then one night he looked at me with those big eyes like I was his whole world. And I realized I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to show up, every day, no matter what." Claire swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. "You've done more than show up," she whispered. "You've given him what most kids never have." Jake stirred the soup, his shoulders stiffening at the raw honesty in her words. He didn't respond, but she could see in his eyes that her words had landed somewhere deep. They ate quietly a few minutes later, the soup simple but comforting. Claire hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful warmed her stomach, chasing away the cold that had clung to her since she left her old life. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself breathe for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," she said softly. When she finished, Jake nodded. "You're welcome. You should get some rest. You can take the spare room. It's not much, but it's clean." When she stepped into the small guest room, she felt her chest tighten again. The bedspread was faded, the furniture plain, but on the nightstand was a little lamp shaped like a rocket ship. She realized this must have been Noah's room once, before Jake moved him into the other. The thought that Jake had made space for her, even temporarily, nearly broke her. For so long she had been nothing but a pawn in someone else's world, valued for power or control. Here, she was simply given kindness, no strings, no expectations. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting over her stomach. For the first time since she had left Daniel, she whispered to her unborn child, "Maybe we've finally found someone who won't hurt us." Across the hall, Jake sat at the table, staring at the empty soup bowl. His mind churned with the weight of it all. This woman, her story, the danger chasing her. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't planned for it. But as he looked toward the guest room door where she had gone, he knew he wouldn't walk away. Something about her had already woven itself into his heart, and though the danger ahead was real, so was the bond forming between them. For Claire, trust had been shattered by betrayal, but in this small house, with a single dad who carried his scars quietly, and a little boy whose innocence lit up even the darkest nights, she felt the first fragile steps toward rebuilding it. And as the night deepened, neither of them knew that the world outside was shifting. Daniel's men hadn't given up. The board of Reynolds Tech was tightening their grip, but here, in this humble home, Claire had found the one thing that money and power could never buy: shelter, not just from the storm, but from the loneliness that had nearly consumed her. The first time in weeks, she closed her eyes and slept without fear. A new beginning together. Morning broke slowly over the small town, the horizon painted in muted shades of gold and gray as the storm clouds finally drifted away. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Jake's house, soft and pale, warming the rooms that had sheltered three souls through a night heavier than any of them cared to admit. Claire woke to the sound of Noah's laughter somewhere in the kitchen, the kind of pure, unburdened sound that made the air itself lighter. For a moment she forgot everything: the fear, the running, the men in the SUV. She lay there with her hand resting on her stomach, smiling faintly as she realized her child was waking inside her too, moving gently as though responding to the joy outside the door. She rose, smoothing her hair with her fingers, and stepped quietly into the hall. What she found in the kitchen made her throat tighten. Noah sat at the table, his little feet swinging above the floor, while Jake stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the kind of clumsy determination only a single dad could manage. The smell of butter and syrup filled the room, and Noah clapped his hands when Jake dropped one onto his plate. Claire leaned against the door frame, her heart catching at the sight. It was ordinary. It was simple. But for her, it was extraordinary. She had lived years surrounded by marble floors and crystal chandeliers, by wealth and luxury, yet not once had she seen a moment as rich as this. For the first time in a long while, she felt what home truly meant. Jake noticed her and gave a small smile. "Morning. Hungry?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She sat down at the table, and Noah immediately grinned at her. "Daddy makes the best pancakes," he announced proudly, though his face was already covered in syrup. Claire laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, and Jake shook his head with mock exasperation. "Best is a stretch, kiddo. Edible is the goal." But his eyes softened when he glanced at Claire. She smiled back, and in that look, an unspoken truth passed between them. They were no longer strangers. They were something more. Yet the fragile peace did not last. By mid-morning, Jake noticed a car parked down the street, too still, too quiet. His instincts prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He stepped onto the porch casually, pretending to check the mailbox, but his eyes tracked the vehicle. Black, windows tinted. He knew immediately. Inside, Claire froze when she saw his face. "They found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. He simply closed the mailbox, straightened his shoulders, and walked back inside. He moved with calm precision, though inside his chest his heart hammered. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This time it wasn't just his life, it was Noah's. It was Claire's. It was her unborn child's. And he would not let anyone take what had finally begun to feel like family. Minutes later, a knock echoed at the door. firm, demanding. Jake opened it slowly, his broad frame filling the doorway. Two men in suits stood outside, their faces blank, their eyes cold. Behind them, the black SUV idled, its engine humming like a predator's growl. "We're here for Miss Reynolds," one of the men said flatly. Jake's jaw tightened. "You're not getting her." The man's lips curled faintly. "You don't understand, sir. She belongs with us. This isn't your concern." Jake stepped forward, his voice steady, unyielding. "The moment you brought this to my door, it became my concern, and let me be clear, you're not stepping foot inside this house." Behind him, Claire appeared, her hand on her stomach, her eyes burning with fear and resolve. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice trembling but loud. "I'm not going back, not to Daniel, not to the board. I'm done being their prisoner." The men exchanged a glance, clearly unprepared for her defiance. One reached subtly for his phone, but before he could, Jake's voice cut through like steel. "You make one call, and I promise you'll regret it. Walk away while you can." For a tense moment, the air was thick with unspoken threat. Then slowly, the men stepped back. "This isn't over," one said coldly. "She can't hide forever." They turned, retreating to the SUV, which pulled away with a growl of its engine. Inside, Claire collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking violently. Jake knelt beside her, his hand steady on hers. "It's over for today," he said firmly. "And when they come again, we'll be ready." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she nodded. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who would fight for her, not because of what she had, but because of who she was. Days turned into weeks. Together they pieced together a plan. Claire, with Jake's help, gathered evidence of Daniel's schemes, documents she had hidden, files she still remembered. With Jake's quiet strength at her side, she confronted the board, revealing Daniel's betrayal. The men who had hunted her were exposed, their lies unraveled. The company was saved, but Claire's greatest victory wasn't in the boardroom. It was in the small house with the sagging porch where pancakes and bedtime stories mattered more than contracts and fortunes. When her baby was born months later, Jake was there, holding her hand, his other arm wrapped protectively around Noah. The moment the newborn's cry filled the hospital room, Claire looked at Jake with tears streaming down her face. "You gave me back my life," she whispered. Jake shook his head, his own eyes damp. "No, Claire. You gave us a new one." And in that moment, the broken pieces of their lives fused into something whole, something unshakable. They were no longer an undercover single dad and a runaway CEO. They were a family, built not on wealth or status, but on trust, sacrifice, and love born in the middle of a storm. The world outside would always carry its storms, its betrayals, its dangers. But inside that home, laughter would rise, love would endure, and two children, one born of pain, one born of hope, would grow up surrounded by the kind of strength that came only from hearts that refused to give up. And as Jake stood on the porch one evening watching Noah chase fireflies while Claire rocked the baby on the steps, he knew his life had changed forever. He had gone to a gas station one rainy night just to fill his tank, and instead, he had found the very thing he never knew he was missing. Someone who turned his house into a home, his survival into living, and his broken heart into something whole again. The undercover single dad and the runaway CEO millionaire had found each other not by chance but by fate. And together they had built a beginning that promised more than either had ever dreamed possible.